So my name is Chris Schnepf. I'm the Area Extension Forester for the University of Idaho. I work out of the Extension Office in Coeur d'Alene, covering the 4 northern counties of Idaho. But I cover, I'm pulled into other parts of the state occasionally as well, as particularly north central Idaho. Today's program is a forest stewardship program. We get a grant every year through the Department of Lands, and Forest Service funding is involved to provide a whole series of workshops, field days, whatnot on forestry, targeted primarily to family forest owners who own a bigger chunk of Idaho forest than many people realize. And so if you can go online to UVI Extension Forestry website and see a whole variety of other programs. The Forest Stewardship Program also includes forestry assistance. Department of Lands is the agency that primarily makes on-site visits with landowners. There's cost share programs available. So it's a multifaceted program with many different partners. Extension's primary lead with it is to offer educational programs like this. Of course, that's a little different this year because of the current COVID situation. So it's if there's, I hate to talk about silver linings with a pandemic, but one of the things that is fruited from this is trying new technologies like this. Our extension forestry programming has been pretty Idaho Panhandle centric. I was struck by some of the folks from South Central Idaho here, and this is something we might consider offering some of other programs like the forestry short course, some other things that don't require field activities down in southern Idaho. So it's going to be an interesting experiment to me to see how this goes and how we might, as a forestry team, use it more in southern Idaho. Why are we offering this program? Idaho's, when talking about land in Idaho, public lands, especially regarding forest and range use, get a lot of discussion. But private lands live large in many Idaho counties. And here in the Idaho Panhandle, roughly 40% of the forest land in these counties is owned by family forests. That's why my position has been structured the way it has been for, well over 40 years in the Panhandle. And I think as you look at individual counties in other parts of the state, you might find some similarly surprising percentages. Even in the Panhandle, there are some counties that are still very dominant to public lands. Shoshone County, where Wallace and Kellogg is one of those up here. Why are we offering this program? Idaho Master Forest Stewards is our group of volunteers. If you're familiar with Master Gardeners, it's a roughly similar model. Our Master Forest Stewards get 70 hours of training, and they go out and do volunteer outreach to other forest owners or anybody interested in forests and forestry. And we've had roughly 100 people participate in the program. Currently, I think we have around 30 to 40 people who are certified and actively volunteering. And we get in these volunteers do a lot of different forms of outreach. Some of it is one-on-one interaction with neighbors. Many of them will write. Some of them will teach in classes and help with us and whatnot. But it also functions as kind of a peer-to-peer learning community. There's a strand of qualitative research called participatory action research that focuses on researchers working with citizens to make change in a local community, which is kind of the institutional job description of extension. And so we rely on Master Forest Stewards and their interaction with other forest owners to help us do needs assessment for extension programs and really make them full partners in developing of programs for family forest owners. And this topic is something they saw as a need. They interacted with a lot of folks, particularly folks that were new to Idaho that have moved from other more urbanized parts of the West in particular to North Idaho, and really had a lot of very basic questions about how to live in rural Idaho and who to call for what types of questions, how do you interact with neighbors, what's culturally appropriate, in rural North Idaho. And they were very much involved in planning this program, including the title for it, which was their idea as well. So I've really come to enjoy. I've enjoyed it from the beginning. But Master Forest Stewards, the idea of them being full partners in helping us design and deliver extension programs, and you're going to see that in full evidence with this session. Normally, this program is a integrated one-day session, and we're trying it this year as 3 separate sessions. I would anticipate in the future we'll probably go back to the in a more integrated form of the program. But I think for current circumstances, this is a worthy thing to try. And we may try offering it again in this format as well. So in the planning, some themes that we had 3 or 4 Master Forest Stewards and Jennifer Jensen, who you'll see speak at another program, sit and visit about what something like this might look like. And the goal of all extension programs is to help landowners manage their lands to meet their goals. There's obviously a public interest dimension to this because we're taxpayer supported. But at the end of the day, we want to empower landowners to reach their management goals as sustainably as possible. There's also, there's a strong land ethic among family forest owners and Master Forest Stewards in particular, and a lot of landowners, if they come to acreage, there's a significant value in doing right by the land. How do you manage land sustainably and still meet your objectives and whatnot? And we operate from a premise that these things are not mutually exclusive. You can make income and still take care of your land and make it even more productive than it was when you first came into the management of it. And land ownership and culture have deep roots in the American psyche. One of the funnest things of my graduate student experience is when I was did my master's in forestry and a second master's in adult ed down at WSU, was a class that was offered jointly between U of I and WSU called The Land and the American Imagination, and did a lot of deep reading on land and American culture and whatnot. Read a lot of books and had some great speakers, and it's really amplified my grounding in this whole arena. And the group thought it'd be good to maybe talk about that a little bit. So America's roots or ties to the land go all that way back to the founding fathers. So Thomas Jefferson, classic quote from him: "Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God. If ever he had a chosen people whose breasts he has made his particular deposit for substantial and particular virtue." That quote reminds me of something John Kennedy said that about the experts he had working with him in the Oval Office, and he said, in some they're just about as competent as Thomas Jefferson having supper by himself. Aldo Leopold is another large figure in Americans and how they view the land. Aldo Leopold was a forester. I always like this photo because looking at that internode on that pine, that's 1 year's growth on that pine tree, and that's very much a forester's look. Although Aldo Leopold is claimed as a patriarch to a number of scientific disciplines in the country. The wildlifers own him to some extent because he started the first academic program in wildlife management in the United States. He was very much a science-based ecologist. So the field of ecology puts a lot of stock in Aldo Leopold. And his classic book, and if you haven't read it, I strongly encourage you to take a look at it. It's a relatively short book titled The Sand County Almanac, and it's a story of Aldo Leopold and his farm up in Dewar County, Wisconsin, which was a farm that had been let go and during the Depression. It was really sandy soils, not really that suited to agriculture, and it was a story of him and his family's efforts to kind of restore that land. And this is kind of an iconic quote from Aldo Leopold. there are two spiritual dangers to not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocery. The other is that heat comes from the furnace. And that's from the Sand County Almanac. Another more recent figure on this kind of arena is a farmer and a poet named Wendell Berry. And he has a farm in Kentucky. And this is kind of a long quote, but I'll go ahead and read it. The small family farm is one of the last places where men and women and girls and boys too can answer that call to be an artist, to learn to give love to the work of their hands. It is one of the last places where the maker, and some farmers still do talk about making crops, is responsible from start to finish for the thing made. This certainly is a spiritual value, but is not for that reason an impractical or economic one. And I always talk about, and the classic book of his to read is titled The Unsettling of America. And but he has a lot of fiction and nonfiction books, and he's really a good writer. So I encourage anybody who's interested in land to. I always like to think of Wendell Berry as putting the culture back in agriculture, and he has some fairly flinty opinions sometimes, but he's well worth reading and listening to. He actually came and spoke in that class I mentioned earlier for 3 hours to about a dozen of us grad students. U of I does a lot of research on land ownership. We have a group called the Policy Analysis Group at the University of Idaho that does research on a variety of forest and natural resource related issues to provide scientifically based feedback for policymakers. And in 2016, they did a large survey of Idaho forest owners. Roughly 2,900 Idaho family forest owners received a 14-page questionnaire in the mail. And it's interesting reading some of these things. And a lot of these questions are really common in surveys of family forest owners. There's probably been 200-300 of these surveys done of forest owners across the country over the years. But enjoying scenic beauty, protecting nature, improving wildlife habitat, land investment, firewood, hunting and fishing, these all come up all across the United States as important values for family forest owners. Other things they talk about is family heritage or legacy, forest products, vacation home site, non-timber forest products like huckleberries, or we're in the middle of morel mushroom season. So these things vary, and the important thing to remember is a lot of these values are somewhat plastic. A lot of family forest owners want all these things from the property in varying degrees, and sometimes those things might change over time depending on what their experience is with the land, depending on family needs and things like that. So many Americans have historically gained all or part of their livelihood from the lands. It's less common for people to have grown up on a farm than it used to be, but it's still very much in our culture. And because of that, many people derive meaning from their relationship with land, even if they don't own much, if any land. That's why public lands are so valued in the Western United States by such a wide variety of people. And again, we operate from the premise that these values are all very compatible with each other if they're done correctly. So some things we hope you will learn over these 3 sessions. One is an orientation to managing panhandle farms and forests. If you're really going to dive in deep on forestry or horticulture or animal science, there's a variety of other programs that will give you more practical skills on managing these things. But you will get a good basic orientation to that over the course of these 3 sessions. How to size up an acreage's capabilities. How moist is your site? Kate will talk about the soil survey. If you live on a dry site out by Post Falls, growing western red cedar, for example, is probably not much of an option. Tips for rural living, and the panel we have at the end of the day, the first part of the session today, is going to spend some time talking about that. Additional educational resources to help you manage your land. There's a sheet that'll be available, I think, Mackenzie, that's in the site, but links will be made available at some point for additional extension publications, also books and other things you can take a look at to enrich your own understanding and ideas about managing your land. Communities of landowners you can connect with. You know, extension is very much about peer-to-peer education. You know, we can do the sage and the sage stage thing like I'm doing right now, but some of our best programs are ones where there's time and space for landowners to get together and talk with each other, and we're going to model that a little bit at the end of the program. But with forestry, there's the Idaho Forest Owners Association, conservation districts sometimes function as this. There's forest owner associations, and I'm sure there's a whole range of other associations with with ag and with animal science as well. Ultimately, we hope this program will help you ask better questions. You know, a lot of what we do isn't so much about giving people an answer, although there'll be a fair amount of that. But a lot of times people need to be asking better questions if they want to really make progress on the land. We hope to help you achieve that over these 3 sessions. Okay, so that's a little bit. I'm going to check to see if there are. I see a Q&A question. This is all kind of new for us. The question is ARCO forest management. Thank you. You know, generally, most of what I'm going to talk about with forestry today applies fairly broadly because we're talking about basic kind of forestry. So ARCO, Idaho, you know, a smaller number of tree species than we have up in the Idaho Panhandle, obviously, but ponderosa pine, Douglas fir, you know, are very common that end of the state, and we'll be talking about a touch in what we're talking about today as well. Randy Brooks, my colleague down in Moscow, is responsible for forestry programming down in southern Idaho, and he had planned on operating some stewardship programs there this year. I'm not sure how COVID's going to affect that, but he has a new extension associate that's working with him, and we have been talking about trying to have some structured forestry programming down south as well. Okay, so that having been said, and Mackenzie, if I'm missing anything, glary comments people have, feel free to jump in and let me know.
Will do. I don't see anything for the moment.
Okay, so let's switch gears here and talk about Idaho Panhandle forestry fundamentals. So again, because it's fundamentals, a lot of the general principles I'm going to touch on here are just as applicable in southern Idaho areas as well as in the Panhandle. And I really appreciate Kate's survey prior, because I was pleased to see how many folks we have from South Central Idaho in particular. And where possible, I'll try and remark a little bit on some of the forestry issues we face down in that part of the state. So family forests in the Idaho Panhandle in particular live fairly large, but actually even in Valley County, you know, there's more family forest land down there than sometimes people appreciate. Statewide, we have 33,000 forest owners with 5,000 to 5,000 acres. I think it's 36,000 forest owners statewide, excuse me, 30,000 in the Panhandle. A lot of them tend to be on the smaller end of that range, but we do have occasional forest owners have as many as 2,000 to 3,000 acres. And if anything, that acreage is increasing. A lot of timber companies are getting out of the business of owning forest land. So they're selling a lot of that in the open market, particularly in South Central Idaho, where the you know, industrial timber production values aren't as high as they are in some other parts of the state. So again, most of what we're going to cover here is pretty basic silviculture. Silviculture is the culture of forests. Silva is Latin root for forests. So silviculture would be the forestry equivalent to agriculture. Again, here in the Panhandle, 44% of the forest land is owned by families. You know, it could be just a couple or a larger family, but essentially not owned by a mill. That's what the industry lands are. And of course, the state-owned Idaho Department of Lands owns a fair amount of land. And then the Forest Service statewide is the largest forest owner, acreage owner. But here in the Panhandle, they're somewhat less than 40%. So forestry is fundamentally forest ecology, you know, and so much of our forest management tries to mimic the natural ecological patterns of our native forests. There's parts of the world where that's not the case. If you look at New Zealand or Chile and whatnot, where they're growing non-native species almost like crops, you know, you can have a debate about where they fit, you know, in that kind of spectrum. But here we're very much managing for native species with a mind towards how these species would have grown here historically or how they grow naturally. So forest ecology is the interaction between all biological organisms in a forest and their environment. It's affected by climate. You know, we have different types of forests here than we do in southern Idaho, and certainly very different from what they would have in Venezuela or tropical areas. It's affected by soils. You know, in Kootenai County, we have a lot of trees growing on glacial deposits, essentially growing on deep deposits of gravel and rock. Whereas if you get down in the Clearwater country, you have trees growing in as much as 3 feet of volcanic ash from when what is now Crater Lake blew up and deposited ash all over the Northwest, and subsequent volcanic eruptions from the Cascades as well. And that means soils that have a much higher moisture holding capacity, and the growth on those sites and on really heavy ash cap soils is pretty comparable to what you'd find in Western Washington or Oregon. Certainly precipitation affects how forests grow. Both the sheer volume of precipitation, the amount of snow and rain a site gets, but also the effect of precipitation. You have a different type of forest ecology on the north side of a mountain than you would on the south side of a mountain, because that north side of the mountain, the moisture lasts longer, so it's available for trees and plants and everything that grows on that hill for a longer period of time. And genetics. One level of this is between species genetics. So in the Panhandle, we have 10 or more major conifer species that we're managing for. But another level of it is within species genetics. So if you have a stand where they've always taken the tallest, best trees in harvest and left the poorer competitors, you're going to have a poorer genetic legacy to work with than a stand in which they've always left the tallest trees. And so that's a very important fact to consider when you're doing thinning or other stand treatments. And disturbance. If we were down in the Piedmont and North Carolina and that places, we could talk about disturbance from hurricanes and whatnot. But in the western United States, the biggest source of disturbance generally has always been fires. And some of these are the big stand replacing fires. For that reason, a lot of our forests are, particularly on the medium to moist kind of sites, tend to be even aged, meaning they all came up after some type of stand replacement fire. But surface fires also played a large role in our forest ecology here. And on the really, truly dry sites, where Douglas fir is the most shade-tolerant tree that can grow, or ponderosa pine, they wouldn't have had as many of the stand replacing fires, and they would have had surface fires coming through the understory as often on the very dry sites, as often as every 2-3 years, maintain these open park-like stands of ponderosa pine. So why do we know all this? Why do we want to know all this stuff? Our forests evolved over the last thousands of years under pre-settlement conditions, and fire was a big part of that. This image you see on the right here is from leftovers of 1910 fires, which had a big effect on everything in North Idaho and forest management, certainly how the Forest Service looks at the world. But the thing to notice about that fire is how much wood was left there after the fire. And that has implications for how we think about forest ecology too. But these forests are, as far as these forests are concerned, it's still 1672 in terms of the sorts of conditions they've evolved in response to. So we need to be aware of those adaptations to those historical conditions. Most of our responses to forest insects and disease problems are preventative. So the idea in that sense, forestry has been practicing integrated pest management from the beginning. How do you manage a forest so it's naturally resilient the various insects and disease problems. A lot of the things that kill trees, you know, bark beetles in a lot of parts of the states do it most spectacularly, but root diseases too are things that once you have the problem, there isn't much you can do other than start a new regeneration cycle with it. So how do you prevent future problems with forest insects and disease? Which forest conditions are most adapted to long-term climatic extremes in your site? So trees are long-lived objects. You're not just thinking about what the weather or climate has been like lately. You're going to say, well, what's a 30-year drought look like in this site, and could this species handle that on that site? Both in terms of species you're growing for and the number of trees per acre. And historically, we've always looked backwards to get a sense of what the historic range of variation of the climate might be like on a site. Of course, that's changed with all the discussion about climate change and whether the future is necessarily going to look like the past. And that's been a very active point of discussion among foresters all across the world last 10 years. You know, another thing to think about when you're thinking about forest ecology is what conditions are needed to perpetuate the desired tree species you want. And so it's very important to understand things like shade tolerance. You know, what are trees' abilities to grow and regenerate in different degrees of sunlight versus shade. Shade tolerance is arguably one of the most important things to understand when you're thinking about silviculture. So shade tolerance is a tree's capacity to develop and grow in the shade of and in competition with other trees. Note that I didn't say shade, whether it loves shade or it loves sun. No tree loves shade in North Idaho. That when you drive by a stand in North Idaho and you see nothing but cedar or hemlock or grand fir, or in Southern Idaho you see nothing but Douglas fir, it isn't because those trees love the shade. It's because those are the only trees that can tolerate that shade. And that has important implications for disease and everything. So you don't need to leave shade to get some of these shade tolerant species grow. Most of them will grow faster in full sunlight. So that's an important concept to understand. And so when we talk about forest succession, how a forest changes over time in terms of species composition and structure or whatnot, forest successions tends to be moved from shade intolerant trees over time to more shade tolerant trees. And this is kind of the relative shade tolerance of our most common Idaho conifers. Our hardwood species, or just broadleaf species like cottonwood, alder, aspen, birch, they would all be at least shade tolerant end of. So they generally be right up there with larch or ponderosa pine. So larch, lodgepole pine, ponderosa pine, these are all considered to be shade intolerant species. Hemlock, cedar, grand fir would all be considered to be shade tolerant species. And how you describe this depends on where you live a little bit. If you're down in Southern Idaho, you know, Douglas fir is probably going to be the most shade tolerant species you have. If you're higher in elevation, maybe subalpine fir or spruce in that part of the world. Up here, it's going to be cedar or hemlock. And then down south, ponderosa pine is going to be and lodgepole pine to some extent, if you're in Island Park in that area, are going to be your more shade intolerant species. As you go further north, you start getting the more larch. And why this becomes important is if you're trying to regenerate species, if you want to regenerate western larch, for example, which is our more shade intolerant species, you probably need to have at a minimum a 2 or 3 acre opening for that species to successfully regenerate. If it's smaller than that, it's going to be outcompeted by the more shade tolerant species. And especially on that small end of it, you may need to do some corrective thinning fairly early on to keep those shade intolerant species in the stand. And this is important because on most sites, our shade intolerant species, larches and pines, tend to be the most tolerant in the face of drought, insects and disease, whatnot. Those of you from Southern Idaho have probably been hearing more about tussock moth in the last year or two. The Idaho Department of Lands has had some major harvests to remove trees that have been defoliated by that insect. Part of the reason that we have more of those insects in recent years is because we've shifted species composition to more of these shade tolerant species by virtue of putting out fires and partial harvest to some extent. So one of the key strategies in actively managing your forest is thinning, and thinning is basically tree removal in an even age stand. And most of our forests started as even age forests after a stand placing fire. You may see trees of different sizes in there, but if you could look at an understory grand fir that's really small, more often than not, if you cut that tree or put a bore into it and count the growth rings, you'll find it's within 20% of the same age as the trees in the overstory. So a small tree is usually a slower growing tree, not necessarily a baby tree. If you've created some gaps and whatnot, it could be a young tree, but in many stands, it's just a slow growing older tree. So reasons to thin. One, and probably the most powerful thing, especially in the more diverse your forest is an opportunity to select the best tree species for whatever your management objectives are. You know, you can think about what's best in terms of what has the most value and whatnot. I'd be careful with that because markets 50 years from now might not necessarily be the same as they are now. But I think most foresters tend to default to which species are going to be the most resilient for that site over the long term. You know, I can't tell you what species would be the most valuable 50 years from now. Nobody would have ever guessed in the Panhandle here that lodgepole pine would someday be worth the same as white pine. White pine used to be the real money tree in North Idaho. But I'm reasonably confident that a green tree is going to be worth more than a dead tree, whether you're talking about, you know, value for getting logging or for just having healthy green trees out there. Thinning is also a way of reducing insect and disease vulnerability. We generally, you know, moisture is the most limiting factor to tree growth in North Idaho. We can't increase moisture by irrigation generally in forestry. So in a sense, the way we irrigate is to reduce the number of hogs in the trough. Forgive me, I grew up on a farm in Northwest Iowa, so farm metaphors are going to come through. But if you reduce the number of trees competing for limited moisture, they're all going to be growing better. So if you increase vigor that way, that tends to reduce insect and disease vulnerability. And it also is an opportunity to diversify a tree species. So if you have a stand that's 90% Douglas fir, maybe you can get the 30-30-30 Douglas fir, ponderosa pine, and larch, and have that more sustainable stand as a result. It's an opportunity to improve genetics. If you get, to the extent you get natural regeneration on the site, and you're not going to go 100% in tree planting, if you can favor the tallest, best trees for their age, those trees are going to pass on those genes to their offspring down the road as well. It's a way to enhance non-timber values. You know, thinning is one of the primary ways to allow more light to an understory. And whether you want, just like seeing understory plants, if you like the wildlife, if you want to thin more aggressively and allow for grazing under those stands, thinning that stand is a way of getting more light to the understory. And there's a whole range of densities you can look at when you start getting, you know, you might thin broader than you would just for forest management purposes to get more understory grasses and stuff going for livestock or for elk and whatnot. And that, as you do more of that, you tend to move more into a field called agroforestry, or more specifically silvopastoral systems, where you're really actively managing for everything simultaneously. And those systems can be quite complex. It decreases the fire hazard. Now, there is a momentary increase in fire hazard from thinning slash sometimes, but ultimately, as that stuff decays, it's harder for fire to go from crown to crown. If a fire does come through, the trees are going to have more vigor and more resilient. And ideally, if you do the thinning, the fire stays on the surface of the ground. On a ponderosa pine stand like this, it'll burn through the understory, but won't get them in the crowns. And ponderosa pine is very well adapted to that kind of fire. So it's not an extreme fire behavior. You can have a fire burn any forest, but it's a question of reducing the probability of tree mortality by thinning in this case. When to thin? Generally, being in thinning early. depending on the density of your trees to begin with. But this is a young ponderosa pine stand. Generally 10 to 20 years is when you start thinning at those things. Maybe even a little bit earlier than that in the cases of a really dense lodgepole pine stand, or if there are specific species you want to favor in there. But generally, you do a first thinning, typically called a pre-commercial thinning, fairly early in the stand. If you remember nothing else about thinning, you want to thin before that crown ratio. Crown ratio is a percentage of the tree's height with green branches coming from it. You want to thin before that crown ratio is less than 40%. Once that stand gets so tight that you only have 20% of the crown left relative to the height of the tree, it's not going to be able to use the new space you've created for it. It won't have much taper in the stem, and then you can lose a lot of trees from snow and wind breakage. Make subsequent things as competition recurs. When crowns of adjacent trees begin to touch is one way of setting out. There's a lot of numerical ways you can look at that as well. Thinning intervals commonly range anywhere from 10 to 25 years. Desired spacing after thinning. Distance between the leaf trees varies on the tree's size and what your, like I mentioned earlier, what your management objectives are. But usually on your first pre-commercial thinning of sapling trees, like you see in this image, you're going to get at least 12 to 15 feet between the saplings. I find a lot of landowners with pines in particular that don't thin aggressively enough, because if you say you thin to 5 feet with the ponderosa pine, well, in 5 to 10 years, you're going to be left with the same issue, an overdense stand. Only now you got larger diameter trees that are harder to schlep around. Plus, you've got to think about bark beetles. Pine engraver is a bark beetle that breeds in pine slash. So generally, with every species but lodgepole, on your first thinning, you're going to want to have 15 feet between the saplings. We plant trees on a 10 by 10 spacing, which is another reference point for you. With lodgepole pine, if you can afford it, it's not a bad idea to do pre-commercial thinnings, 1 to 6 feet, and then out to 15 feet. Because if you take lodgepole pine right out to 15 feet, you can end up with a big round bush. So it's a little bit of density can be a good thing for tree growth and form. On older trees, if you got 20-inch diameter pine on a drier site, you might go as much as 50 feet between trees. Or again, if you're also managing to stimulate the understory. Leave trees. After you meet your spacing needs, which trees will reduce insect and disease problems? Which species are best for the site? Which trees have growth and form characteristics that are things you want to favor looking forward in your stand? What's going to enhance the genetics of your forest? We have a little booklet called Logging Selectively that goes through all these individual characteristics you can favor or not favor as you choose trees to leave in your stand. Which trees will produce the highest value trees in the next harvest if that's one of your objectives? So what growth and form are you looking for? Which trees are growing rapidly in height and really taking advantage of the site the best? Which trees will support wildlife growth objectives? A dead tree in the forest is not necessarily a bad thing, depending on your objectives. Those can be important when they're standing for a variety of wildlife species, and then when they fall to the ground, a lot of critters will use them as well. If this is within 100 feet of your house, I generally wouldn't leave snags because they can be a hazard to fall on the house or fall on people. But outside that zone, go ahead and leave some snags if wildlife are important. So species, again, which species are best adapted to the site over the long term? Generally, you want to favor the shade intolerant species for whatever your site is, particularly on drier sites that are going to be more moisture limited, particularly during drought years. Within that range of species adapted to the site, if you have, for example, cedar or hemlock on the site, but you don't have any white pine, well, if you have cedar or hemlock, you can probably have some white pine on there. So you might want to plant, or larch is another great species to have if you right conditions for it to grow, because it's probably our most root disease resistant species site. And in the 10 northern counties of Idaho, root diseases are by far the #1 tree killer. They don't kill trees as flashily as bark beetles do, but they'll definitely take a lot of stems out there. Root disease tends to kill trees slowly in degree, whereas bark beetles tend to turn the whole crown brown within a year. Which ones have the most commercial value? How long will you grow them? You know, lodgepole pine is a lot more viable species now than it used to be, and you see in this slide, you know, on the right side, lodgepole pine can grow as fast as any species we have. So a lot of people are really taking a second look at that species, depending on where they're working. Which species have the most wildlife value? You know, particularly in southern Idaho, but also in other parts of the state too. If wildlife are important to you, sometimes aspen can be a good species to favor, especially if you have a good thicket of it. And so if you have wildlife in there, sometimes you do have to actively manage aspen to keep them going. Primarily keep the deer and elk out of them, or to keep other conifers from overtaking those stands. Which species have most aesthetics value? You know, some species that a lot of people love seeing cedar on their property if they have a site that's suitable for it, or birch is another species. Birch is a very shade intolerant species, so if you want to have it or want to keep it, there's some things you got to do to actively to keep it in your forest. Otherwise, it's going to be replaced by more shade tolerant tree species. Growth and form characteristics. A lot of people say they like to log selectively, but if selective logging leaves the trees like you see in this slide, that is dysgenic. You're leaving the poorest quality trees. In a sense, you're almost breeding smaller, poorer form trees. The other thing you notice is almost all the trees that are left in that stand are grand fir and Doug fir. And repeated efforts of that are one of the things that's given us more problems with root diseases and defoliating insects across Idaho. Again, most of our forests naturally are even aged because they regenerated after a stand replacing fires, except on the very driest sites. So if you're just cutting everything over a certain diameter, you're degrading forest stand genetics. So wherever possible, if you can favor dominant trees, those are the tallest trees dominating the canopy, rather than the poorer competitors, those trees are going to be more stable in your forest, and they're going to pass on their better genes on the offspring. Generally speaking, favoring good height growth, you know, pointy tops versus kind of flattened or rounded tops, or longer distances between the sets of branches will indicates better growth on that tree than something that's shaped like an umbrella. Again, it's kind of like we referred to the thinning. Favor trees have at least a 40% crown ratio. Probably the number one growth and form thing to look for with tops is, with tree selection, is forked tops. You know, if you have trees that have forked or broken tops, or really big, you know, kind of gnarly branch coming out the side, those are strongly genetically influenced and very inheritable. And they tend to be weak spots in the tree where it's more likely to break in winter snow load. So whenever you can, if you have a choice between a fork top tree and a tree without a fork, generally speaking, favor the tree without the fork. And also look at things like needles, good color and length for the species. Again, we have a booklet called Logging Selectively that goes into this. There's also a video that you can watch from the U of I Extension Publication website that goes through all these kind of characteristics as well. If you see trees with obvious crook, sweep, taper, a little bit of taper can be a good thing, but it can be excessive as well, depending on your objectives. But crook and sweep in particular, those trees are more likely to break in wind and heavy snow loads. So if you can favor a straighter tree, that's a good thing. Insects and disease, again, the number one tree killer in North Idaho is root diseases, and even in southern Idaho, it's a pretty big deal. So wherever you can, if you can favor larch and pines, they tend to survive root disease best. The root diseases will nibble on their roots, but they typically won't kill the tree. And when I say root diseases, there's 4 or 5 different species that can decay roots. Armillaria and laminated root disease are the biggest ones, but there's some others as well. The number 2 tree killer is bark beetles. In terms of insect disease, fire is obviously a big tree killer as well. But there's a number of different bark beetle species we have. generally the bark beetles are specific to a genus of trees. So pine bark beetles just hit pine, Doug fir beetles just hit Doug fir. And generally the strategy with bark beetles is reduce stocking. So even if the bark beetles hit it, they don't successfully reproduce in it, and favor the most drought tolerant species for the site. So again, leaving the best species for the site adequately spaced is the best insurance for just healthy green trees, regardless of what your management objectives are. And again, one reference point, what is the most shade tolerant tree you can find on your property? If Douglas fir is the most shade tolerant tree you can find, you should probably be managing primarily for ponderosa pine on that site. You know, if you've got grand fir on your site, then maybe some ponderosa pine and maybe a little bit Doug fir, maybe a little bit of larch. If you've got cedar or hemlock on your site, then the world is your oyster, and you can grow a whole range of species. But that's a good, you know, beginning point to start thinking about this. As you look in the understory, you know, what is the most shade tolerant species that you can find in the stand? And that's generally the one that's really pushing the ecological envelope for the site, and probably one that's going to give you more problems down the road. Just a few words on reforestation. If you want to plant trees, we do offer normally a half-day tree planting workshop every spring. We had to cancel it this year because of the COVID, but our forests do seed in naturally. But to get that, you need a seed source. May need some site preparation. Most of our conifers germinate best on bare mineral soil, and sometimes you have to do some things to create that a little bit to have that seed bed. You know, will you get the species you want? You know, that high graded stand I showed before, you see nothing but grand fir and Doug fir. You're not going to get white pine or larch in that stand unless you go out there and plant it. You know, do you have the species you want in the overstory? Is it even possible for them to seed in naturally? And again, what seedling species, kind of back to the same thing we've mentioned, what species are most adapted to the site over the long term? And generally, that's going to be the most shade intolerant species that are suitable to the site, which will seed in naturally. I generally don't recommend people plant grand fir and Doug fir very often, partially because of the root disease issues, but also if you can have grand fir and Doug fir or lodgepole a lot of times too, you've got all kinds of naturals out there. So why not spend your tree planting money and not a significant amount of labor if you're planting yourself on species that you're not going to have coming in naturally. You know, which species will add to site-appropriate diversity? You know, it's good to have a mixed range of species within the range of species that are adapted in that site. If you do have white pine, and that's primarily Latah County north, although there's some down in Idaho County in places, but it's primarily on federal lands. If you can prune them, you can reduce mortality from a disease called blister rust by half. So if you have young white pine come up naturally, you're going to, if you plant them. We have a extension publication on pruning to restore white pine that talks about some of the things you can do to help those along and help them survive a non-native disease we have called white pine blister rust that really can hammer blister white pine quite a little bit. When you do plant, you'll often hear other landowners talk about what percentage of their trees survive. There's a lot of different threats to seedling survival. The most critical time for seedling survival is in the first 2 years. They're getting their roots established. There's already plants likely out there. They're competing with them for moisture. So how can you help those trees survive? The biggest tree killer, I would say, for planting is lack of moisture or competing vegetation. The main way of dealing with that is to reduce competing vegetation. So mats or mulch around seedlings, scalping, you know, basically tillage around the places where you're planting the trees, or herbicides are a good alternative as well. If you and we have a number of really good publications that talk about a range of options for reducing that competing vegetation. You know, if you are looking at a herbicide or something, it's important to remember what we're talking about is one spot application over the 80-year life of the stand, just to create a window for that seedling to successfully establish. conifers do establish naturally, but without that competition control, you know, we still have sites left over from the 1910 fires that haven't reforested because the site's so dry that shrubs kind of own that site, and it takes longer for trees to reestablish there. Deer and elk can be a problem, especially for family forest owners. You know, especially nice succulent planted seedlings, they'll come in and nip the terminal buds and sometimes maintain trees in a bonsai state for a period of years. So if you can, typically, if you can have some, if you know, talk to your neighbors. If you know you're going to have deer congregating in winter range, in an area you're planting trees, you know, they'll go after those seedlings. So sometimes your points ahead to put up some. The most effective thing is physical protection, called Vexar tubes, the plastic mesh tube, which you may have seen out in the woods that people put, and they're basically protecting that terminal seedling. There's also deer repellency you can use. The ones that use fermented egg solids can be effective if they're applied correctly. You know, you hear all kinds of remedies, home remedies out there, hanging up bars of soap or you know, various things. Generally, those things aren't terribly effective. For a while, there was a rage to try capsaicin, the ingredient, hot chili peppers, and apply that to seedlings. And the deer just saw that as Cajun seedlings to eat. So generally, the physical barriers are most effective if you can get them. Pocket gophers and others, if you, the area you're seeing mounds of dirt in the area you're planting trees, you might want to consider doing some preemptive pocket gopher control. Trapping is an option. There are poison grains that you can put down and get them down under the soil surface so non-target animals won't eat them. We have some excellent extension publications on gopher and rodent control as well. Livestock, generally speaking, if you can keep cattle and whatnot out of the planted area the first 5 years, you'll have a better survival rate. The issue isn't so much livestock eating tree seedlings as much as trampling them. Once they get 4 or 5 foot tall, you know, the animals tend to eat around the trees. But prior to that, trampling is a big issue with livestock sometimes. Again, think about those things before you put trees in the ground, and then after you plant trees, it's important to come back and monitor to see if you're having good survival rate. If you're not, you know, going in there and replanting promptly is important in terms of that competing vegetation. There's a variety of assistance available to family forest owners. U of I Extension, our primary role is education, so we offer a variety of workshops, field tours, videos, publications, etc. We have extension faculty in Idaho, in 42 of Idaho's 44 counties. Unfortunately, don't have any foresters south of the Clearwater River, but we're always discussing how to offer more programming down there. The Idaho Forest Association is Idaho's forest owner association, started in 1982. Have roughly 300 to 400 members. If you're not a member of this, I encourage you to take a look at it. Among other things, I think it's like $35 a year, something like that, to be a member. And among other things, you know, they represent forest owners in Idaho's legislature for laws that apply to family forest owners, and you know, they engage agencies that work with forest owners. They also combine with forest owners associations in Washington and Oregon to produce this magazine called Northwest Woodlands, which is comes out 4 times a year. I contribute articles to it, you know, periodically, as do other extension foresters. And it's really 20-30 pages. Comes out 4 times a year. You know, the IFOA membership is worth it, if nothing else, just to get this magazine. So really an excellent resource for forest owners. And it's one thing to listen to me pontificate about you know, planting trees. It's another thing to talk to another landowner or hear about another landowner who's planted 3,000 seedlings and has the chiropractor bills to approve it. So I encourage you to look at some of these peer-to-peer learning opportunities as well. And this is their website. They're also part of the National Woodland Owners Association, which also has its own magazine as well. American Tree Farm System. run by state level committees of foresters and landowners and tree farmers. If you've seen the signs up, that means that that property has had a management plan and it's been inspected and certified by a professional forester. Some mills offer a bonus for tree farm logs because those logs help them meet forest certification requirements. You know, mills want to be able to sell wood that can be sold at retailers as having been grown in a sustainably managed forest. And tree farm is one of the things that helps them comply with those kind of certification standards. Kind of like organic certification in a sense, only it's looking at whether the forests are being managed in a way that's sustainable. And there's the website for tree farm. Technical assistance, Department of Lands. Again, they provide on-site assistance through forest practice advisors, private forestry specialists. They do on-site assistance. The biggest part of their job is inspection of logging jobs for compliance with state laws, but they also do the one-on-one technical assistance as well. If your property is below a certain size or above a certain size, it may encourage you to work with a consulting forester instead, depending where you're at to see what their work looks like. They also work closely with the cost share program. Some of these things, tree planting, whatnot, can be a fairly significant investment, and depending on your circumstances, you may be able to get cost share money to get trees planted, to do pre-commercial thinning, whatnot. The biggest cost share program available to family foresters right now is something called EQIP, and we've been doing a half-day workshop on that last couple of years on the cost sharing programs, so you may want to take that in as well. Sometimes there's a fair amount of paperwork with the cost share programs, but most landowners that I know that have done it have felt like the paperwork has been worth it, and actually has been fairly manageable. NRCS also provides some assistance, primarily related to soils and planting. You know, we have a couple of foresters with NRCS up in the Panhandle. Generally speaking, in other parts of the state, they're going to work with the IDL office for you on cost share programs. They are the primary owner of the EQIP program and stuff, so you may engage with them as part of the cost share program as well. Conservation districts are locally elected officials who guide conservation efforts. Strong ties, the NRCS, they often share the same office, but they are a different entity. They are elected by local citizens to serve on those conservation district boards. Increasingly, they get a lot of grants, particularly related to water quality. So a fair number of forest owners have gotten involved in some conservation district grants to restore or improve water quality in the area. This is up by Grouse Creek in Bonner County, where a landowner got a fairly substantial sum through this cost share program of the district to rehabilitate these stream banks along the stream. And you know, this is some fairly high-end improvements they're making, and most landowners, you know, would have been able to afford to do that on their own without the cost share assistance. And there's obviously public value in that as well as value to the individual landowner. Consulting forester provides management recommendations, related services for a fee. A consulting forester doesn't buy logs or work for a mill. You know, mill foresters can provide good assistance to landowners and everything, but at the end of the day, they're working for the mill, not for the landowner, whereas a consultant actually does work for the landowner. For credentials for choosing a consulting forester, there are occasionally folks that will represent themselves as a forester that don't necessarily meet the forestry community's definition of what a forester is. So some credentials to look for consulting foresters. One is Association of Consulting Foresters, ACF, probably pretty strongest credential in forestry in the United States. You know, they have a trial membership period that people have to pass, intensive training for consulting foresters, and we have this directory that has a listing of Idaho consulting foresters. I should say one of the primary criteria for what defines a forester is whether they have a 4-year degree from a university that's been accredited by the Society of American Foresters. It's a professional association of foresters. So U of I, Oregon State, WSU, University of Montana, and whatnot. And this directory, the front end of it, has 4 pages that outlines, you know, how to choose a forester, whether you're working with an agency forester with a consulting forester, and then has a listing of consulting foresters in the back and lists all their credentials. Particularly if you're looking at doing a timber sale, I would strongly encourage you to work with a consulting forester. I did my master's research on consulting foresters, and there's pretty good body evidence that most landowners who work with a consultant actually make more in their sale after paying the consultant than they would have trying to do the job by themselves. And the consulting forester should do this a number of ways: by putting the timber out for bid, by finding a logger that offers the best combination of good work and value, and also by sorting the logs, taking the logs to different mills or paying different prices for them as well. Financial assistance for family forest owners. Again, they're cost sharing. In cost sharing, essentially a government agency or increasingly a private organization will provide partial financial assistance, hence sharing, to help private landowners apply practices that also provide public benefit. So tree planting, pre-commercial thinning, stream restoration, a whole variety, wildlife improvement sometimes is a possibility. Usually local IDL, private forestry specialists, are a good first point of contact to find out about these cost share programs. The biggest one, most used by far, is the EQIP program, but in some cases Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation will provide assistance if something's going to benefit elk. In other parts of the United States, Rough Grouse Society has cost share programming available. Trout Unlimited will sometimes work with landowners as well. So there's other possibilities as well, but probably 90% of it is through the EQIP program through the NRCS and Idaho Department of Lands. Again, the big ones is the EQIP program, administered by NRCS, but in places where NRCS doesn't have a forester, which is most of the state, they'll be working with IDL or consulting foresters. If you hear the term TSP, that's basically a technical service provider that's been trained and sanctioned by the NRCS to work with them on these cost share programs. Again, a wide range of cost shareable practices, not just in forestry, but some of the other things that our other speakers we talk about in agriculture. There's cost share programs for, I believe, pasture innovations, things like that as well. Sometimes there's special funds dedicated. For example, in Spokane River watershed, there's extra EQIP funds that are available for specific purposes to help improve that watershed as well. Tax-based assistance to family forest owners. We have two forest property tax categories: bare land and yield and productivity. With one of them, you pay a bare land and yield, you pay a lower property tax rate, and then if you ever do a harvest, there a percentage of money comes out of that harvest for yield tax. Productivity, you pay a little higher rate every year, but then it's if you do a harvest, that money is all yours. None of it goes to pay for taxes. Either of these options is typically much lower than the standard market value of the property. It's not an exemption. A lot of people will call it an exemption like we have for homes, but so it's not really an exemption. It's a lower property tax rate based on a different land use, similar to lower property tax rate that ag lands pay. Arguably, this is the most effective, certainly the most commonly used fiscal incentive to active forestry in Idaho. You need to have at least 5 acres, excluding an acre for the home site, to qualify for it. So if you're not already in one of these two categories, you should probably take a close look at that, because it'll save a significant portion of your tax bill. And the nice thing about this is something you get every year compared to the cost share program. Law does require that land and tax in these categories be managed for wood products. That doesn't mean you have to be managing your property like a timber company. All it means is that you have to stay in typically have to have a management plan for it, depending where you're at. But what you can't do is say this is going to be a preserve from which there will never be any logs cut. At that point, that the whole purpose of the law is to empower people to manage for wood products to aid local economies and whatnot. And of course, managing for wood products doesn't mean you can't also manage for wildlife and the whole range of values that family forest owners have for the property. One of the ways of documenting that, which many northern Idahos require, is a written forest management plan. And in some cases, you can write your own plan, and we offer a 6-week short course to train people on how to write their own plan. But if you do write your own plan, whether with us or on your own, some counties will require a graduate forester to sign off on that after a site check as well. So check with your county assessor's office, and they can tell you what you need to do to get these property tax-based assistance. There's also income tax-based assistance for family forest owners. You know, many of the incentives for forest management are built into the federal tax codes. For example, there's a reforestation tax credit you can take advantage of. They're especially critical when you're harvesting timber. It's important when you're harvesting timber to separate the value of the timber on the property from the value of the land, and that can have, you know, an impact of thousands of dollars on, depending on the size of the property and the sale, on the income taxes associated with that you get with the income from a timber harvest. If you're interested in explore that, you may want to talk to your accountants, especially if you have an accountant that you're already comfortable with. Most accountants aren't really very familiar with these laws in Idaho. A few are, so you know, I wish we had a list of accountants who have been trained in this to share with you, but we don't currently. We've had some discussion of that. But one option is, if you have an accountant you're comfortable with, make them aware of some of these resources in helping you reduce your tax burden for forest management. And probably the single best one-stop shopping for that is an easy website to remember, timbertax.org. Most foresters didn't go into the field to become accountants, myself included, but there are 4 or 5 people across the country housed with either the Forest Service or with the universities who really have specialized in the forest tax law, and they put together this timbertax.org website. So it'll make you aware of all the forms. There's calculators and stuff on there for you. It's really a great place to start if you want to start sizing up how you might treat your property differently in terms of income taxes and your forest management objectives. Finally, before we move on with the rest of the program, don't forget about fire. Fire is a big part of our ecology, and if you're thinking, you know, that somehow you're in a magical place that will never get affected by forest fire, be honest, you're wrong. We maybe, unless you're in the middle of a city or something like that, or in the middle of, you don't have trees, but even range fires can be a big issue in some parts of the state. Fire was a big part of our ecology. It's not if, but when, and we should be thinking about fires the same way people in Oklahoma think about tornadoes. So some key issues about fire protection: if you live in your acreage, it's important to remove fuel in the home ignition zone around your house. We have this publication that's downloadable from U of I website that Yvonne Barkley and myself and a fire physicist named Jack Cohen authored that goes through that, particularly in and attached to your house. It's not just the vegetation around your house, but if you have a shake roof, you know, wood shake roof on top of your house, that is the single biggest point that's going to affect your fire risk on your property. So this publication is available. We also have other publications that deal with reducing fire risk in your forest. Again, those are available on UI Extension Publications website. So most homes, you know, the thing to remember these fires is you may think you're going to be able to stay there protector, but you know, when you really get the homes burning down, they're usually in these big project fires where you're not even allowed to get to your house, especially if you're not there presently. So your house is pretty much going to be on its own. So what are the things that you can do for the fire to not ignite your home? And most of those things are attached to the individual house. Okay, for more information, again, this logging selectively booklet, this thinning publication, Oregon State, PW publication is also very good. This pre-commercial thinning publication is good for small trees. U of I, there's a number of places to get tree seedlings. The U of I has tree seedlings. Conservation districts also have tree seedlings in some parts of the state. This publication comes with the seedlings you'd order from U of I, and it's really good 4-page primer on tree planting. If you're interested in pruning, this pulp from Oregon State's good. You know, leaving some organic debris out there in the woods is a good thing for forest health, wildlife, long-term forest nutrition. This publication is available from the U of I on that. We have the directory I mentioned earlier and the fire publication that I just discussed. And this is that, excuse me, this last item is that publication on reducing fire risk on your larger property beyond the kind of home emission zone area, and that's also available for download. Okay, questions?
Hi, Chris. I don't see any questions. We can just hang tight for a moment while people get a chance to put them in a chat. Rebecca did ask about fact sheets or bulletins for specifically forest thinning, and I think you covered a lot of great resources that we'll be sure to get up on the website for folks to look at. This presentation will also be available in a PDF form, so for all the participants, you can definitely go back and refer to that.
Somebody put up the quote from Wendell Berry, "Be joyful, you have considered all the facts." Be joyful though you have considered all the facts. I love that.
We do have a question from Nicole. She asked, what's the best way to remove stumps after thinning?
Oh boy. I'm hearkening back to my days as an extension agent or Orofino when I used to get those kind of questions. If first of all, if it's a forestry situation, you don't need to remove the stumps. Just leave them in place. If you are trying to convert something into a pasture, probably what I've certainly seen this done on home sites, is when they cut the trees, they leave a little higher stump, and then an excavator or something just comes out and pulls them out during the more moist time of the year. I think bringing in heavy metal of some kind like that is probably the most effective. You can, in theory, burn stumps, and there's things that have been sold that you can pour into stumps and it'll burn them. I know of Paul Stamets has a company called Fungi Perfecti where he sells mushroom kits, and it seems like he's been I've seen stuff from him advocating, you know, advancing the decay in stumps, and if you can get more moisture into them, that will certainly help that process as well. But generally speaking, it's just hard work with heavy equipment, I think, is the most effective.
Great, thank you. I don't see any other questions at this time, but we can definitely come back to any questions that come in. Oh, I take that back. One more. Diane asked, where can I get information or advice for growing a few trees in my pasture with the intent to harvest for home use firewood?
I've never heard that question quite framed that way. You know, one dimension of it there is the pasture and how many trees are compatible with a pasture, because they are going to shade the grass out there. Another dimension of it is what trees are best for firewood, and larch and Douglas fir tend to be have the highest BTUs for the wood, so they tend to be popular. In a pasture, you got the full sunlight, so if you have enough moisture, larch would be a great tree to have at the edge of the pastures. But we don't have a publication targeted to that specific thing. I think the main thing, I'm just kind of thinking about this for the first time, but if you wanted trees in a pasture for firewood, the first thing is, if you're going to plant the trees, you need to protect them from the livestock in that pasture, because they're going to trample them or rub them and whatnot. Maybe the best strategy is to have them at the edge of the pasture too, in terms of maintaining grass out there. Sean thinks about permaculture a lot. I may ask him to comment on that too when he's up as well.
Sean, feel free to comment now if you'd like to jump in if you have any thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, there are a couple of things, like Chris said, it's kind of this weird sub-discipline of agroforestry. So you might even look at this as forest farming or silvopasture, where you have a line of trees that's protected that could be for firewood, and we do some of that. And then to go to that stump question, which is really excellent, we have silvopasture areas where we run pigs through lightly wooded areas, and we have thinned those areas, and we just left the stump. So it really depends on what your use for the area is. So that's the one thing I would add on that. But yeah, all good comments. And I agree. If you really want to clear all the stumps, you probably got to bring in an excavator.
And there was a follow-up question about that. If you do bring in an excavator to dig stumps, will that damage the roots of neighboring trees, or maybe what considerations should you make when doing that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if there's really been research on that specifically. I know as I look at various subdivisions that are done, they're pulling out the stumps and leaving some trees, and really treating those trees fairly badly in terms of leaving subsoil on top of a soil and smothering roots and things like that. And I'm frankly kind of amazed at what trees manage to survive in some of these developments where they've left trees. So I wouldn't be too worried about that. I mean, I think there's some strategies to think about. If obviously you want to avoid dinging up the trees with the equipment any more than you have to. The other thing is if you can use equipment that's on tracks instead of wheels, you'll cause less soil compaction, because compaction could be as much of an issue with the neighboring trees as much as anything. But all that having been said, in my experience, those neighboring trees are fairly resilient to a lot of that, especially if you're leaving the best species for the site. When I'm talking about thinning, if you have a stand that's dominantly Doug fir and grand fir, and you leave dominantly in Doug fir and grand fir, and you had any root disease in there, and most sites in North Idaho, you have some root disease fungi out there. It's not that you have it or you don't have it. These are all native fungi that are endemic to our forests. And I tend to look at root disease. Some of my compadres in this telecast have heard me to say this before, but I tend to look at root disease the same way a fisheries biologist friend of mine looks at bullheads, which is small catfish that you find all through lakes. He believes the entire surface of the earth is covered with bullhead eggs waiting for somebody to build a pond. And that's not a bad way of looking at root disease, especially in the panhandle. So if you have mostly Doug fir and grand fir, you pull some stumps and you leave mostly Doug fir and grand fir and impact the roots a little bit, you can actually see root disease accelerate on sites where you remove stumps, because the stump removal has also been talked about as a way of reducing root disease, and they've done some of that on the coast to some positive effect. But I think the main thing I'd be thinking about in terms of saving existing trees would be to use less ground compacting equipment, something on tracks rather than something on wheels. And then and if you don't need to remove the stumps, if you're not going to do tillage out there, if you're like Sean having stuff grazing through there, I would just cut the stump as low to the ground as possible and maybe avoid the whole issue.
Great, thank you so much. We have a question from Carly, and she's asking, she doesn't have trees on her property, but they'd like to plant some native species like shrubs or trees or grasses along a seasonal stream. Mm-hmm. So would the resources you've mentioned help with that, or are there perhaps some other more specific resources for planting shrubs and grasses along a seasonal stream?
What part of Sadian does the caller in?
Oh, we'll wait for her to maybe put that in the chat, Carly, if you wouldn't mind.
While she's typing that, UI sells a variety of shrub species as well as conifer species you can plant. So if you check with your local district or extension office, they can tell you what kind of shrubs are native to your area. Shrubs are not terribly difficult to establish, especially on a seasonal stream. You know, on a perennial stream, sometimes the challenge of planting deciduous plants is that the beavers come in and want to make lunch out of them, and so that can be an issue. And there's cases you can put up with that, but I think any of the agencies that work with streams, districts, conservation districts, IDL, whatnot, if you don't want to do planting or extension, if you want to do planting on streams, we're happy to meet with you and talk about what species and where you can get the supplies, because that's, we haven't talked about care and feeding of streams in the context of this program, whatnot, but generally temperature is one of the most limiting environmental dimensions to a stream in Idaho. So all of our forest practice laws associated with streams are designed to keep more shade on streams so stream temperatures stay down and are still suitable for trout and other cold water species. So boy, my hat's off to you for getting more shrubs and trees planted next to a stream. Okay, so you live in Moscow, so yeah, there's a whole range of plants that you can establish there. Serviceberry, alders will do really well on streams. Red osier dogwood would do well in Latah County. And the U of I Research Nursery right there in Moscow sells a variety of those species. Cottonwoods and aspens are also really good around intermittent streams as well.
Great. Thank you so much. The next question we have is from Wendy, and she's wondering about carbon markets and options for forest landowners. Is there any work or focus on small forest landowner carbon credits as an additional revenue generator or incentive for a forest landowner?
I'm on a national committee that was been looking at that, based out of Michigan State, and we just put together a carbon trading class primarily for foresters, but several of our Master Forest Stewards help with the beta testing of the curriculum. Currently, the only forest owners who can really play in the carbon market are really large acreage owners, like $3,000. It costs so much currently to get involved in the program that it really isn't geared very well for small landowners in terms of getting economic return. Now, there's, if a person wants to sequester more carbon and do their part for the planet, we certainly have a lot of tools to help you with that. But in terms of participating in carbon markets and getting a return, it's kind of difficult at this point in time. What we may see down the road is there may be cost share programs to help people implement carbon-friendly practices. So, and you can make the case that the tree planting workshop or tree planting funds and stuff that are available through the EQIP program and everything are part of that. But there may also be programs, rather than figuring out some kind of scheme to pay people for the carbon they sequester, what are ways that you can help them sequester carbon that at least don't cost them anything? And for example, one of the things that a lot of people are doing research on and talking about that is, could you get cost share monies to apply biochar to your forest? Biochar is essentially charcoal, although it can be produced in a lot of different forms. And a nice thing about charcoal is it doesn't decay very quickly. It stays sequestered in that soil, and in many cases, biochar or charcoal will improve the fertility of soils or the functioning of those soils for plant and tree growth. So I expect to see something like that possibly down there. Oregon has played with and there are some firms that are trying to aggregate landowners and see how they, if they could, say pool 110-acre owners and put that out in the carbon market and see what kind of return they can get from that. But boy, when you look at your time involved with that and all the energy that goes into it and the amount of return, you have to question how much it's worth it at this point.
Great. We have one last question, and that's from Todd, and he's asking, Are pocket gophers also known as ground squirrels, or maybe are there some different species, across the state that we could consider?
Well, there are different species of both, but pocket gophers and ground squirrels are two completely different critters. Ground squirrels are, you might think of them as miniature prairie dogs. They're spending most of their life above ground feeding and stuff, and you see them running around and everything. Pocket gophers spend 90% of their life underground, and they're have really small eyes, and about the only way you see them is if you're trapping them, and you pull one out in a trap. So they're very different animals, and ground squirrels really for forestry aren't much of a problem. Pocket gophers are a problem because they'll go down in the winter in particular and eat on tree roots and kill tree seedlings. And this is true with deer as well. If you're planting trees, you got to be thinking about animal damage because you're planting seedlings that are nice and succulent, nicely fertilized in the nursery and everything. So a lot of times pocket gophers and deer and everything will chew on those seedlings before they chew on the wild ones because they're so tasty looking, and maybe smelling too. I don't know. But pocket gophers are the issue, and we have some. I believe we have some UI extension publications on pocket gopher control. Oregon State has a publication on controlling pocket gophers in forestry. And then I'm not sure what the exact site is these days, but there is a Internet Center for Wildlife Damage Control. And if you search on that, you'll come across it. It's been housed in different configurations over the years, but it's a whole series of publications and other resources on controlling or managing nearly every vertebrate species that can be a problem in the United States or North America. And what I really love about some of their curricula is they talk fairly deeply about the biology of all these. And we're talking about everything from pocket gophers to nutria to starlings to elk and moose. And they really do a good job of talking about the biology of the species. So, the key thing in managing these things is understand the ecology and biology of the critters before you start applying control measures.
Hi, Chris. I will put some links in the chat on specifically that the bulletin that you mentioned, the PNW.
Sounds great, Kathy.
Wonderful. Well, I don't see any other questions